So welcome back to the last video of the Black History Month. Today we're talking about Frederick Douglass. He was a formerly enslaved man who became a prominent activist, author, and public speaker. He became a leader in the abolitionist movement, which sought to end the practice slavery before and during the Civil War. After that conflict and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, he continued to push for equality and human rights until his death in 1895. Douglass's 1845 autobiography narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, described his time as an enslaved worker in Maryland. It was one of 5 autobiographies he penned, along with dozens of noteworthy speeches, despite receiving minimal formal education. An advocate for women's rights, and specifically the right of women to vote, Douglass's legacy as an author and a leader lives on. His work served as an inspiration to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and beyond. Now, who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in or around 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. Douglass himself was never sure of his exact birth date. His mother was an enslaved African-American woman, and his father was white and of European descent. He was actually born Frederick Bailey, his mother's name, and he took the name Douglass only after his escape. His full name at birth was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. After he was separated from his mother as an infant, Douglass lived for a time with his maternal grandmother, Betty Bailey. However, at the age of 6, he was moved away from her to live and work on the White House plantation in Maryland. From there, Douglass was given to Lucretta Auld, whose husband Thomas sent him to work with his brother Hugh in Baltimore. Douglass credits Hugh's wife with first teaching him the alphabet. With that foundation, Douglass then taught himself to read and write. By the time he was hired out to work under William Freeland, he was teaching the other enslaved people to read using the Bible. As word spread of his efforts to educate fellow enslaved people, Thomas Auld took him back and transferred him to Edward Covey, a farmer who was known for his brutal treatment of enslaved people in his charge. Roughly 16 at this time is when Douglass was regularly whipped by Conway. Now, Frederick Douglass escaped slavery. After several failed attempts to escape, Douglass finally left Covey's farm in 1838, first boarding a train to Havre de Grace, Maryland. From there, he traveled through Delaware, another slave state, before arriving in New York. In the safe house of abolitionist Dave Ruggles. Once settled in New York, he sent for Anna Murray, a free black woman from Baltimore. He met while in captivity with the Alds. She joined him, and the two were married in September 1838. They had 5 children together. Now, from slavery to abolitionist leader. After their marriage, the young couple moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they met Nathan and Mary Johnson, a married couple who were born free persons of color. It was the Johnsons who inspired the couple to take the surname Douglas, after the character in the Sir Walter Scott poem, The Lady of the Lake. In New Bedford, Douglas began attending meetings of the abolitionist movement. During these meetings, he was exposed to the writings and abolitionist and journalist William Lloyd Garrison. The two eventually met when both were asked to speak at an abolitionist meeting, during which Douglas shared his story of slavery and escape. It was Garrison who encouraged... William Lloyd Garrison. It was Garrison who encouraged Douglas to become a speaker and leader in the abolitionist movement. By 1843, Douglas had become part of the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100 Conventions project, a 6-month tour through the United States, where Douglas was physically assaulted several times during the tour by those opposed to the abolitionist movement. In one particular brutal attack in Pendleton, Indiana, Douglas's hand was broken. The injuries never fully healed, and he never regained full use of his hand. In 1858, radical abolitionist John Brown stayed with Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York, as he planned his raid on the U.S. military arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Part of his attempt to establish a stronghold of formerly enslaved people in the mountains of Maryland and Virginia. Brown was caught and hanged for masterminding the attack, offering the following prophetic words as his final statement. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. 2 years later, Douglass published the first and most famous of his autobiographies, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. He also authored My Bondage and My Freedom, along with Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. In it, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, he wrote, "From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace. And in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom." He also noted, "Thus is slavery the enemy of both the slave and the slaveholder." Now, Frederick Douglass in Ireland and Great Britain. Later that same year, Douglass would travel to Ireland and Great Britain. At this time is when the former country was just entering the early stages of the Irish potato famine or the Great Hunger. While overseas, he was impressed by the relative freedom he had as a man of color compared to what he had experienced in the United States. During his time in Ireland, he met the Irish nationalist Daniel O'Connell, who became an inspiration for his later work. In England, Douglass also delivered what would later be viewed as one of his most famous speeches. That's the so-called London reception speech. In the speech he said, What is to be thought of a nation boasting of its liberty, boasting of its humanity, boasting of its Christianity, boasting of its love of justice and purity, and yet having within its own borders 3 millions of people denied by law the right of marriage? I need not lift the veil by giving you any experience of my own. However, that can put two ideas together must see the most fearful results from such a state of things. Now, Frederick Douglass's abolitionist paper. When he returned to the United States in 1847, Douglass began publishing his own abolitionist newsletter, the North Star. He also became involved in the movement for women's rights. He was the only African American to attend the Seneca Falls Convention, a gathering of women's rights activists in New York in 1848. He spoke forcefully during the meeting and said, "In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a greeting injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral of intellectual power of the government of the world." He later included coverage of women's rights issues in the pages of the North Star. The newsletter's name changed to Frederick Douglass's paper in 1851 and was published until 1860, just before the start of the Civil War. Now, during the brutal conflict that divided the still young United States, Douglass continued to speak and work tirelessly for the end of slavery and the right of newly black Americans to vote. Although he supported President Abraham Lincoln in the early years of the Civil War, Douglass fell into disagreement with the politician after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which effectively ended the practice of slavery. Douglass was disappointed that Lincoln didn't use the proclamation to grant formerly enslaved people the right to vote, particularly after they had fought bravely alongside soldiers for the Union Army. It is said, though, that Douglass and Lincoln later reconciled, and following Lincoln's assassination in 1865, the passage of the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which respectively outlawed slavery, granted formerly enslaved people citizenship, and equal protection under the law, and protected all citizens from racial discrimination in voting. Douglass was asked to speak at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial at Washington, D.C.'s Lincoln Park in 1876. Historians, in fact, suggest that Lincoln's widow, Mary Todd Lincoln, bequeathed the late president's favorite walking stick to Douglass after that speech. In the post-war Reconstruction era, Douglass served in many official positions in government, including an ambassador to the Dominican Republic, thereby becoming the first black man to hold high office. He also continued speaking and advocating for African American and women's rights. In the 1868 presidential election, he supported the candidacy of former Union General Ulysses S. Grant, who promised to take a hard line against white supremacist-led insurgencies in the post-war South. Grant notably also oversaw passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which was designed to suppress the growing Ku Klux Klan movement. And then in 1877, Douglass met with Thomas Auld, the man who once owned him, and the two reportedly reconciled. Douglass's wife, Anne, died in 1882, and he remarried to a white activist in 1884. In 1888, he became the first African American to receive a vote for President of the United States during the Republican National Convention. Ultimately, though, Benjamin Harrison received the party nomination. Douglass remained an active speaker, writer, and activist until his death in 1895. He died after suffering a heart attack at home after arriving back from a meeting of the National Council of Women, a women's rights group still in its infancy at the time in Washington, D.C. His life's work still serves as an inspiration to those who seek equality and a just society, or a more just society. Well, after all that, it's finally the end of Black History Month. I shall see y'all next week. I do have some stuff planned for next week for y'all to see. And then after that, I shall see y'all in the upcoming videos. If I can get that through. But yeah, other than that, today's the end of Black History Month, and tomorrow starts a new month, so I have new content coming next week. Other than that, I shall see y'all in the next video. Bye, guys.